Tonight, something fundamental cracked inside a federal courtroom, and most people still don't understand what that means. This was not a bad day for a legal team. It was not courtroom drama. It was a moment when an institution decided it would no longer absorb pressure quietly. In a single afternoon, behavior that had been tolerated, negotiated around, and cautiously restrained was met with the most severe response available. Not warnings, not delay, removal. Immediate, surgical, and irreversible. I've spent decades studying what happens when systems are pushed to their limits. Courts, states, economies. And there is always a precise moment when restraint ends and authority reasserts itself. Today, that moment arrived. This was not about Donald Trump as a person. It was about what happens when power confuses endurance for weakness and disruption for leverage. If you want to understand how institutions actually defend themselves when chaos becomes strategy, stay with me. Because what happened today did not begin today. The warning signs were there long before the courtroom finally went silent. To understand why today mattered so much, we need to strip away the headlines and look at the structure beneath them. Federal courts are designed to tolerate pressure. They expect confrontation. They are built to absorb aggressive defense tactics, political noise, even public outrage. That tolerance is not accidental. It is a feature meant to protect fairness. But tolerance has limits. And those limits are not written only in statutes. They are enforced through judgment, precedent, and the quiet authority of the bench. What unfolded here was not a spontaneous reaction. It was the end of a long calculation. For weeks, the defense had tested boundaries. Not once, repeatedly. Small violations, then larger ones, each time measuring the response, each time learning how far they could go without consequence. This is how systems are probed, not with one dramatic strike, but with incremental pressure. And when that pressure becomes coordinated, deliberate, and destabilizing, the issue stops being legal advocacy. It becomes systemic risk. That is the line the court was watching. And once that line was crossed, the response was no longer optional. To see how that pressure built and why it escalated so fast, we have to go back to the conditions that made this confrontation inevitable. Long before today's courtroom rupture, this trial was already operating inside a distorted environment. Not legally, but structurally. You had a defendant who was not just a criminal accused, but a former president, a political candidate, and a media force all at once. That combination changes incentives. It bends behavior, and it compresses timelines. In ordinary federal trials, defense strategy follows a predictable arc. Suppress evidence, challenge procedure, preserve appeal. Here, a different logic took hold. The trial itself became a stage. Delay was no longer just a legal objective, it was a political asset. Conflict was no longer risk, it was messaging. History matters here. Courts have faced powerful defendants before. Industrial barons, organized crime figures, even presidents. And each time, the judiciary learned the same lesson. If the court hesitates, the process erodes. If it absorbs too much disruption, authority leaks out quietly. That is why modern federal courts evolved to act early, not late, to intervene before chaos hardens into precedent. The system is designed to prevent one trial from poisoning the next. By the time this case reached its current phase, the conditions were set. Pressure was rising, signals were flashing, and the court was already preparing for a moment it hoped would never arrive but knew it might. The first real rupture didn't arrive with shouting or spectacle. It arrived quietly, in procedure. A routine cross-examination that wasn't routine at all. Questions resurfaced that had already been ruled out. Evidence reappeared that had been explicitly excluded. Accusations were floated without foundation, daring the court to respond. At first, the judge did what judges are trained to do. Warn, correct, recalibrate, one warning, then another. Each one a signal, this is your last opportunity to step back inside the rules. But instead of retreat, the pressure intensified. The tactics became sharper, more coordinated, almost defiant. This is the moment many trials turn. Not when the jury is present, but when the court realizes intent. Because mistakes look different from patterns, and patterns reveal strategy. What the court saw was not confusion, it was escalation. At that point, the risk was no longer delay or disruption. The risk was collapse, a mistrial, a poisoned jury, a precedent that chaos could be rewarded if executed aggressively enough. That is when the court made its choice. And once that choice was made, there was no room left for half measures. What looks like chaos from the outside often follows a logic on the inside. And this is the part many people miss. The defense strategy here was not random, it was systemic. It relied on a familiar mechanism: overload the process, force hesitation, and create just enough instability to make the institution doubt itself. This is how complex systems are stressed, not by one dramatic violation, but by many small ones stacked carefully together. Each objection pushes the clock, each media contradiction blurs public understanding. Each procedural breach dares the court to respond more forcefully than it wants to. The goal is not victory in court, it is leverage over the system. But courts are not passive arenas. They are adaptive organisms. They monitor patterns. They track intent. And when they detect coordination rather than error, the rules change. What had once been tolerated as aggressive advocacy is reclassified as obstruction. That shift matters. Because once conduct is understood as a threat to the process itself, the court's obligation is no longer neutrality between parties. It becomes protection of the system. That is the hidden switch most defendants never see until it flips. By the time it did here, the outcome was no longer about persuasion. It was about containment. And containment, by definition, requires decisive action. And that is exactly what transformed the next hours from a legal dispute into a defining institutional moment. Once the court recognized containment was necessary, events accelerated with extraordinary speed. This was no longer a trial moving forward, it was an institution sealing a breach. Proceedings stopped. The jury was removed. The room went silent. And silence in a courtroom is never empty. It signals authority preparing to act. What followed was not theatrical. It was procedural, deliberate, and devastating. The judge addressed counsel directly, not emotionally, not rhetorically, but with language that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Repeated violations, deliberate defiance, no alternatives remaining. This is where the second crisis erupted. Because removal is not just punishment, it is structural intervention. The court didn't target behavior in isolation. It targeted the architecture that made continued obstruction possible. Leadership, coordination, command. By acting immediately, the court denied the defense what it wanted most: delay, confusion, and narrative chaos. No mistrial, no recess, no opportunity to regroup. The disruption was cut out at its source. Legal experts would later call this surgical. But surgery is only calm after the incision. In the moment, it is a high-risk decision made under pressure, one that permanently reshapes everything that follows. And from that point forward, the balance of this trial shifted irreversibly. Now, I want you to step out of the courtroom and think about what this means for you. Because moments like this don't stay confined to legal transcripts. They shape expectations, they redefine trust, they tell citizens whether rules still matter when pressure is applied. If courts hesitate when power disrupts the process, ordinary people pay the price later. You see it in slower justice, in selective enforcement, in the quiet erosion of fairness that never makes headlines. That's why today mattered beyond this trial. The court wasn't defending itself for prestige. It was defending the idea that procedures protect everyone or they protect no one. For many Americans watching this unfold, the reaction wasn't triumph or outrage. It was something closer to relief. Relief that the system did not blink. Relief that disruption did not earn reward. Relief that authority still has a spine, but there's also unease. Because when institutions are forced to act this forcefully, it means the stress has been real and growing. You don't reach this point unless restraint has already been stretched thin. If you've ever wondered whether accountability still applies evenly, this was a rare moment when the answer became visible. And that visibility is exactly why it resonates so deeply. What happens next won't just affect one defendant, it will echo far beyond this courtroom. Once an institution asserts itself this clearly, the effects don't stop at its own walls. They travel. Courts watch other courts, governments watch judges, and allies and adversaries alike take notes. What happened here sent a signal far beyond one federal trial. Disruption will not be rewarded even when politics is loud. In a global context, this matters more than many realize. The credibility of American institutions has been questioned for years, not because of outcomes, but because of perceived hesitation. When systems appear unable to discipline powerful actors, confidence erodes quietly, both at home and abroad. Today interrupted that pattern. Foreign governments, investors, and legal observers understand something basic. Stability depends on predictability, and predictability depends on enforcement. A judiciary that enforces its own rules under pressure restores confidence not through speeches, but through action. This moment also complicates political narratives. It becomes harder to argue that institutions are either captured or collapsing when they demonstrate autonomy this decisively. That doesn't end polarization, but it raises the cost of attacking the system without evidence. What we witnessed was not just a domestic legal correction. It was a reputational event, one that reminded the world that systems can still hold if they are willing to act. The question now is how this assertion reshapes what comes next. Because when authority re-enters the equation, futures diverge quickly. From here, the future splits into three clear paths, and which one materializes depends less on the court than on the response to it. In the first scenario, the system stabilizes. Replacement counsel complies. The trial proceeds on schedule. The shock of removal serves its purpose. Discipline returns, theatrics fade, and the case is decided on evidence rather than disruption. In this outcome, today is remembered as a necessary correction, painful but contained. The second scenario is more volatile. Compliance happens on paper, but resistance shifts outside the courtroom. Appeals are framed as persecution. Public messaging intensifies. Pressure moves from procedure to perception. The trial continues, but legitimacy becomes the battlefield. The court holds, but under sustained political strain. The third scenario is the most dangerous. Obstruction doesn't stop, it mutates. Court orders are challenged indirectly. Public attacks escalate. Institutional authority is tested again, forcing the judiciary to choose between further escalation or restraint. This is where systems face their greatest risk, not from one violation, but from cumulative defiance. What history teaches us is simple. Institutions don't fail in one moment. They fail through repeated hesitation. Today was an interruption of that pattern. Whether it becomes a turning point depends on what follows. And that brings us to the real conclusion of this story, what this moment ultimately tells us about power, law, and accountability. What happened in that courtroom was not about winning or losing a case. It was about something far more fundamental, whether institutions still remember why they exist. Courts are not designed to be popular. They are designed to be firm when popularity would be easier. And today, the system chose firmness. Power always tests boundaries. That is its nature. It pushes, probes, and pressures until it discovers where resistance lives. For a long time, the question hanging over this trial was whether resistance still existed at all. Tonight, that question has an answer. The rule of law does not survive because it is admired. It survives because at critical moments, it is enforced, quietly, decisively, without apology. That is what made today different and why it will be remembered long after the personalities involved fade from the headlines. But this story is not finished. Institutions do not prove their strength once. They prove it repeatedly. What happens next inside the courtroom and outside it will determine whether this moment becomes a precedent or a footnote. If you want to understand how power adapts after it is checked, how narratives are rebuilt, and how systems either harden or fracture under continued pressure, stay with me. Because the next phase of this trial won't be decided by chaos. It will be decided by whether the system holds.